So you all are here to learn about soil health assessments. And I would love to get a quick show of hand. Who here has used soil health assessments, either in-field or laboratory assessments? I would have guessed that, Marie. Anybody else used any of them? Carrie, I see your thumbs up there. And Allison. All right, so most of you have not used soil health assessment, it seems like. So I will keep that in mind as I talk through this. Those of you who have, I would love for you to jump in with questions, with snippets of your experiences. I think it's always really helpful to hear how that has actually gone on the ground with farmers in various parts of the country. So please do feel free to chime in. Any of the rest of you, if something's not clear, I'd love to do this fairly informally so that you can ask the questions that you need. I've got 33 slides, I think, in total, so we can get through those. We can speed up some of them to get to other things if we want to, so we can do this pretty flexibly. So soil health assessment. First, I want to tell a bit of a story about this pairing right here. We talked about this side by side yesterday, right? We had the conventional farmer with a lot of tillage on the right side here, and no cover crops, no soil health practices. Strawberries weren't working anymore. Now sweet corn wasn't working anymore. This was at a time when I was at Cornell University, went to New Hampshire to work with a number of farmers to develop the initial framework for soil health management planning that today is available nationally from Natural Resources Conservation Service. So we're making progress. At the time when I walked onto this farm on the right, they handed me a standard soil test and said, it looks like everything's all fine. I can't tell what's wrong, but things just aren't growing, right? So we went in with the soil health test, a laboratory soil health test, and actually, walked onto the farm and looked at the soils in the field and got a whole lot of good conversation happening. I did this with a collaborator and long-term friend of mine, Doran Cox, whose farm is also in New Hampshire on the same soil type. He today leads Open Team and is a research director at Wolf's Neck, has done a whole lot of work in the space of data sharing. And his farm is a very diversified livestock, vegetables, grain, everything is integrated kind of farm, same soil type. Everything was working well. They had some nutrient issues, right? So when you look at a standard soil test that really just looks at nutrients available to the crop that everybody has access to across the country, that kind of testing would have said that the soil on the right was in better shape than the soil on the left. But what was missing was looking at the biological and physical function of the soil. Standard soil testing that we've had for decades doesn't show you much about soil health. If you measure organic matter and you know how to interpret that number, it starts to give you a little bit of a perspective. But our standard soil testing, standard nutrient soil testing that most universities have available, there's a lot of companies across the country that do that kind of soil testing, it will not show you whether your soil is healthy or not. Because back in 2000, early 2000s, we did not have anything available like that. And so it comes back to what I was saying about health yesterday, right? If you go to the doctor and they don't know to test for COVID, but you have COVID, you're not going to know. And that's where we were a couple of years ago, right? I mean, people were coming down with it all over the place, but there wasn't testing available for everybody yet. And so we, started to have an idea about what was going on. And this is kind of where soil health has been at. Over the last 20 years, we've gone from there was no soil health testing available, and there was very little awareness of soil health and how to assess whether your soil was healthy or not, to today, there's a lot more awareness. People, at least in a lot of places, know to think, oh, well, it might be a soil health issue. Testing is starting to become available, but it's still not very common. So we talked about this downward spiral, right? Most of our soils across the country, I would argue, are degraded. There's something we can do better on most farms. And for those who have a lot of experience working across the farm landscape, most likely most of what you've seen is degraded soils. So you just think that it's normal that if there's a downpour, you're going to get a lot of puddles, that the soil cracks when the weather gets dry, that downpour leaves your field saturated and you can't get in with a tractor for a week or more, right? You think that these things are normal because that's what we see across the landscape, and we haven't had that awareness. But the science has moved far way along. We know a lot more about the importance of the biology, and we've, for some longer time, known how important the physical properties of the soil are. And that's where NRCS started with its soil conservation aspects. It was all around sort of the physical aspects, the physical manifestations of poor soil health. Erosion is a symptom of a root cause of not having a great soil ecosystem with all those biota functioning the way that they should. So we've got a lot of degraded soils. How do we turn that spiral around? I would argue a first step is to do a soil health assessment for many, many reasons. The first reason is if you're walking onto a farm, you're talking with that farmer about what some of their challenges might be, being able to understand what the constraints are, what the resource concerns are on that farm is really critical, because that's the start of the conversation. We have a really good understanding of nutrient limitations, right? That's been one of the big successes in agriculture. If we know there's not enough phosphorus, we can add some and we're good to go. It's pretty simple that way. And that's been figured out for a long time. But beyond nutrient limitations and excesses, we need to really assess what those constraints are, right? Are the aggregates falling apart? Do we have adequate, large, continuous pore space so that when that rainstorm hits, that water goes into the soil instead of running off, carrying all the good stuff with it? Do we have good nutrient cycling so that our organic matter is able to provide a large fraction of the nitrogen that our crop needs? Is there, of that organic matter, is it high quality organic matter that has lots of that nitrogen in it? Or is it the kind of organic matter that doesn't really have much nitrogen? So yeah, you can cycle it and other nutrients might come out of it, but it might not have enough nitrogen, right? So being able to assess for those kinds of functions is really important. And that then allows you to target management practices. If you know what's wrong, you can fix it. If you don't know specifically what the problem is, you can't really fix it, right? It's coming back to our same doctor analogy. I think it's a good one when we're talking about health, right? If you don't know what's wrong with your health, it's much harder to fix that. If you do know specifically, okay, I've got a broken bone, well, we know how to fix those things. So targeting management practices to alleviate the specific identified constraints is, to me, one of the most important aspects of how a farmer can use soil health assessments. If you know that your issue is subsoil compaction, the soil is really, really dense, about 6 to 8 inches down, then you know that what you need to do is break up that compaction at depth in the soil. You couldn't see it if you didn't measure it, because we're walking on the surface. We don't know there's compaction down there. We have to either dig down or use a penetrometer or something along those lines. Then we can start to think about, okay, well, what management practices do we use specifically to address the constraint we just found? And a lot of them are practices that work for a lot of these constraints, but they can be tweaked to specifically address the constraints that we find. Another reason for soil health assessment is to be able to measure improvement over time. If you walk onto a farm today, it is severely degraded. You do a laboratory soil health assessment, it gives you some numbers to start with, and you can go back 5, 10 years later and see, okay, well, have we made improvements? How much better is it now? And that's kind of at the core of a lot of our new carbon programs that you're going to hear about more today, right? If we can measure or at least model where we're at today, and then in 5 to 10 years know, okay, how much have we accomplished, right? That's, we get at that by measuring those differences. Or today we can do a lot with modeling, but measurement still has a key role to play. Facilitating applied research, there's still a lot of research going on in the soil health space, and having a standard set of indicators that everybody can use so you can compare across studies has been really valuable as that has started to happen. Improving awareness generally of how critical soil health is and what the benefits are, what some of the opportunities are. Soil health assessments can be eye-openers to farmers. I worked with a lot of farmers now back some time ago, one-on-one, walking into their fields, showing them a soil health assessment report, being able to look at it and say, okay, look, you know, it looks like chemically you're doing great. You've been managing that for 10 years, and that might be a way to reach somebody. Look, you know, you've been doing this for a long time. You're doing it really well for what you've been able to assess. Here are some new assessments that you've never seen before. So it makes sense that you haven't managed for these things that nobody has shown you are there, but okay, now you're empowered with the soil health assessment. Now let's see if we can make some progress there. Some other interesting potential uses are enabling farmland valuation, right? It's not something that is implemented much yet today, but I would argue that farmland that is really healthy is going to be a lot more valuable than very severely degraded farmland. Being able to use assessments like that as an underlying baseline of, look, here's how healthy your land is today. Gosh, that's really valuable. You should be able to sell it for more if you're selling it. You should need to pay more for land that is in really good shape. And if you're buying really degraded land, it should come at a discount, because you're going to have to invest to build its function back up before it can really do all of the things we expect from our land. Assessment of farming system risk, right? If you know that you have severely compacted land that has its aggregates falling apart, nitrogen's not cycling well, that's going to be a much more risky system. If your biota aren't doing well, if you don't have a healthy ecosystem of lots of organisms, pest pressure, pathogen pressure is going to be higher. And so you can use an assessment to gauge a little bit of how likely that is to be more or less risky. And then to enable policy recommendations, I think there's a lot of potential there. And that's a space that AFT works a lot in also, you know, being able to understand how critical soil health is and how soil health looks across the country, and being able to say, hey, look, this is a place where policy really needs to make an impact. That's yet another space. So lots of good reasons to do soil health assessments. I want to share with you sort of an overview of what those assessments are. And then I'd love to hear a little bit from you about how you might think that you might use them. So there's two basic approaches to assessing soils. One is in-field assessment. In-field assessments tend to be qualitative or semi-quantitative. They tend to be rapid, right? You walk into a field, you do a few things looking at certain aspects, sticking a shovel in the ground, sticking a penetrometer in the ground to get a basic idea. They're really good instant conversation starters. They're not great for tracking differences over time. They're not great for comparing different management scenarios, but they give you a good start. Laboratory assessments, on the other hand, are quantitative. They're recently more available, so that's great. And they're great for a longer term conversation with the farmer and monitoring over time the impact that you're making. But they take some time, right? You have to go out to take that sample, you have to ship it to the right lab, you have to wait until the results come back, and it's generally not a couple-day turnaround the way that it is with nutrient analysis. So it takes a bit more time and takes a bit more of an investment because there's a cost. But both of these types of assessments play really important roles in getting out there and having conversations with a farmer and helping them transition to better practices. While I was at NRCS, we defined soil health resource concerns. We improved two that were already there, compaction and organic matter depletion. And because the planners at NRCS would come to the soil health course and then go back and say, well, I learned all this great stuff, but our tools, our programs don't actually give me the ability to help farmers implement these practices because I don't even have a way to document in the system that they have soil health issues, right? And it goes back to some of the conversation we had yesterday about how IT drives a lot of what NRCS does. So we made some progress. There's a lot of progress left to be done, but we made some progress getting those IT tools, those software programs to at least recognize and give space for documenting soil health issues. So we added soil organism habitat loss and degradation and aggregate instability to the resource concerns that conservation planners can assess when they walk onto a farm. So that's a good thing to know if you're out there, if you're connecting with NRCS or technical service providers that work with NRCS to get farmers into these programs. A thing to suggest is an evaluation for those resource concerns. And then soil health testing can be actually financially, you can get financial assistance for soil health testing now. And the in-field assessment I'm about to show you is part of the planning process at this point. You just need to find somebody who actually has the time, and that's often the issue. We developed a cropland in-field soil health assessment that is a nationally available assessment that's online. I have the link at the end of the slide set. And Beth, I don't know if you have the most up-to-date slide set. We may need to update with the slide set that's now in the slide decks if you put it onto the platform yesterday. So it'll be available. But so there's this in-field assessment that we developed that takes very simple, very cheap tools, right? Everybody has access to soil survey. You take out a shovel, some knives, some water, some sink strainers, infiltration rings if you have them. Take some notes, bring out a clipboard, a camera. If you have a Munsell color book, that's great, but you don't need one, right? So a lot of these simple tools, a penetrometer, and you can go out there and do some pretty good assessing of where things are at. And that allows you to document that in the NRCS system, or you can just have a conversation with the producer if you're doing that not as part of NRCS practices. If you're not aware of this tool, web soil survey is something to look up and explore a bit, because you can get the soil type on any farm you walk onto. So all the way to basics. If you don't have a soil science background, if you've never encountered this tool, it's a very useful tool for figuring out soil type and what you can at a baseline inherent properties expect from your soil. It does not, however, show you how management has influenced that soil type. So you can figure out the soil type that a farm is on. That's incredibly helpful for things like, what's the texture of that soil? Are you dealing with a very clay, poorly drained soil? Or are you dealing with a very sandy, droughty, extremely well-drained soil, or anything in between? Are you dealing with a lot of rocks so that using a penetrometer might be tough? Are you dealing with a fragipan, which is a kind of compaction that isn't management-based, but that's part of just how that soil was farmed, usually due to glaciation? So you can find those kinds of things based on the farm soil survey, but then you can go into the field and do an in-field assessment that is more based on the impact of management. There's a document online with NRCS. I have the, I don't think the link to that is in this yet, but maybe. There's an in-field assessment that you can actually go through step by step that starts with a farmer interview, so you can understand a little bit about the background of that farm. And then there are 11 indicators that you can assess in the field. And I'll just briefly go through a couple of those. The basis of this assessment was that it was designed for somebody, once they've got a little bit of experience doing those, you can go out into a field and in about 10 to 15 minutes, you can go through these indicators or most of these indicators and assess where that soil is at. It's based on sort of a yes, no, you're figuring out a threshold. Is that indicator constrained or not for each of them? Couple of indicators that are in that tool set. I'm not going to go through all of them for lack of time, but you can review that online. So there is the link here. Soil cover is basically the percent of the soil surface that is covered by plant residues, by organic mulches, or by live plants. And there's basically a method for across the field figuring out, okay, do you have more than 75% cover after planting? If yes, then that's a pretty good sign that soil cover is in good shape. If it doesn't have more than that, if you have less than 75% cover after planting, then there's something to work on, because we really want our soils covered more than that. So you can see here, side by side, here's cover cropped plot right next to not cover cropped, and you can see the difference in how much soil is showing. And this is going to lead to a healthier soil. Here's an image of somebody planting straight into a growing cover crop with zone tillage equipment. And again, you keep that soil covered. It's good for weed suppression. It's good for temperature regulation, for moisture regulation. Lots of benefits for that cover. You can go out and assess surface crusts. If you have evidence of surface crusts on less than 5% of the field, that field is probably in pretty good shape. If you have surface crusts that you're seeing, and you'll see this particularly a few days after a rain as things tend to dry out, if you have that in more than 5% of the field, that's a sign that there are some soil health issues that you want to be addressing. And here are just a number of pictures of what those kinds of crusts look like. You can pick up a piece of soil and it'll have this kind of very flat, very parallel to the ground kind of, everything is just layered from crusting, from falling apart aggregates. You can see crusts like this between the rows usually. You can see that things are harder here at the surface. You can see that water has run across the surface and that's going to lead to crusting. If you're out there while it's wet, you're not going to see those crusts because it hasn't dried up. But you're going to see those muddy surface layers of the soil. You can assess for ponding right after a rain. Water should drain fairly quickly. Even if you have a pretty intensive rainfall, if you have evidence of ponding 24 hours or less after a typical pretty hard rainfall event, you're probably in pretty decent shape. But if there's water standing more than 24 hours later, or if you have really serious signs that there was a lot of ponding across the field, you want to be looking at soil health. Ponding, when it happens in corn and in crops that really depend on a lot of nitrogen, will lead to nitrogen issues, because when you have ponded soils, when you have very wet soils, a lot of the nitrogen that would otherwise be available to the crop is lost as either nitrous oxide or nitrate that leaches. So you really don't want a farmer in that situation. This is an agronomically significant loss due to ponding or heavy saturation. And you get that a lot more in soils that are not healthy. So it's a way to sort of economically communicate to a farmer, hey, you know, nitrogen is expensive and you want a well-drained field. You want a field that doesn't get that kind of saturation, because that's how you're going to save and hold on to that nitrogen fertilizer so you can get the economic value from it. Penetration resistance or compaction, you can go out with a penetrometer, you can go out with a spade, you can go out with a wire flag and figure out whether that soil is really hard. If you have granular structure in the surface, if you have the appropriate pounds per square inch reading with a penetrometer, it'll show you you're in the green. Generally 200 pounds per square inch, that's fine. So you start getting above that, especially up to 250, 300. That's really too much. You don't want your soils to be that hard. You can also check for vertical channels or roots, and if you have plenty of those, then you tend to not have a compaction problem. But if you have platy structure, if you have too high a penetrometer reading, if you can see root restrictions, if you see surface ponding, all of those are signs that there are issues. So you can get a penetrometer. They're usually a couple $100, and they're a really great tool if you are out walking fields with farmers a lot. Having a penetrometer with you is a really great way to inform a farmer, to start that conversation with the farmer and try that out. You can also just stick a spade in the ground. And if it's really hard, if you're having a hard time getting in, if you're standing on your shovel and it doesn't go in, it means that your roots are going to be having issues. Here's a couple other signs, right? This kind of plating. Roots that are crooked like this are a sign that that root went down, hit a hard layer, traveled along one of these cracks, and then finally found a way to go down, right? If you have all root in a big soil clod and there's not full root exploration like there is here, but instead you've got this one little lone root and it's just not making it in, it doesn't have access to those nutrients or that water or that air. It's not gonna do well. So you want to point a farmer to noticing these kinds of issues. Aggregate stability, we've talked a lot about aggregate stability, right? There's just a lot to dig into here. And you can do a number of these tests in the field. You can bring those cylinders to the field if you have them. They're not that expensive, but you can also create makeshift really easy ways, right? A little bit of wire in a see-through plastic cup, like what you would bring to a party. And you can put two clods in side by side from in the degraded field and from the fence row, and show that difference. And you can really visualize for the farmer just how important aggregate stability is. There are instructions as part of this in-field assessment, so you can get a semi-quantitative assessment of aggregate stability in the field. And some soils are going to slake more easily than others just based on their soil type. And so while there are thresholds in this assessment, just be aware that those thresholds are going to mean something a little different for different soil types. So, you know, more than 80% remaining stable, you would want that. Some soils are going to get there more easily than others. Just a couple more images of what you might be looking at, right? If you see this kind of cottage cheese consistency, chocolate cake, nice crumbles, that's much better than if you've got these big clods. Here's a couple of images of the slump test side by sides, right? Nice crumbly texture versus this is falling apart into mud. You saw Doug Peterson presenting that yesterday in that video. Feel free to bring that video back up if you're unfamiliar with that, to really kind of drive home how different these soils will be when you do a simple test like a slump test with a sink strainer and a plastic cup, right? It doesn't take a lot of equipment to get a basic assessment. And visualizing it in the field, right? You've got a big rainstorm going on. If you see this kind of muddy runoff, that's an aggregate stability problem and possibly a compaction problem. And you can see that at a glance. You can see it from the road. You don't even have to get out, get your boots muddy. If you're seeing this, there's a soil health problem going on. And it's a great conversation starter with the farmer. Plant roots, biopores are other things you can look at. You can dig up a shovel full of soil and see, you know, do you see that plant roots are following dark brown channels where organic matter has been deposited by prior roots? Do you see lots of intensive rooting, really fibrous rooting throughout the profile? You know, do you see that kind of crumbling? Do you see a lot of organisms in the soil, right? There's even an app for that. We worked with our colleagues at ARS who worked also across a couple other organizations. And they developed a mobile app to guide you through that soil health assessment. And actually at this website, there's a number of videos online for how to do these assessments that might also be helpful. I think most of those are in more Western climates because that's where this ARS colleague is, but I think that nevertheless, they're useful. So we went through a quick in-field assessment. Now there's also a laboratory assessment. You're maybe, depending on your job, less likely to do a laboratory assessment than walking out into the field and assessing a few things in the field. But I want you to be aware that that kind of testing exists now. It is becoming much more available, and cost share for it is also becoming much more available. And this kind of assessment tackles that issue of, yeah, if you're only looking at nutrients, you're not going to see you have soil health issues in the soil test. But there's been a lot of work done over the last 20 years. Back in 2006 at Cornell University, we put out the first ever publicly available soil health test. Before that, it had been the space of researchers, and a lot of amazing work got done the 20 years before that in the research space. And we then assessed a bunch of the indicators that were available at the time and said, okay, here's something we can put together at a reasonable cost to a producer that can be made available with an interpretation that means something. Working at NRCS, we then worked across a lot of different stakeholders to get consensus on which methods to use, because as soil health was getting measured more, there were still methods all over the place. The numbers were different. It's hard to compare and compile the research in a way where you can really develop good recommendations to the public when there's so many different methods out there. So we built some consensus around laboratory methods and put out a technical note for 5003 that if you're interested in that kind of thing, it's there, it's available for your review, figuring out which of these methods might be the best ones to have available to the public. And then recently, Soil Health Institute put out recommendations. We worked together on identifying sort of the broader, here are all the different measures that should be looked at, the different methods that should be looked at. And Soil Health Institute was able to get a large grant, I think $6.5 million, to work with 100 scientists across the country on long-term research plots to measure all of the same indicators on all of these management comparisons. And they really whittled it down. And we could have some discussion about how much we want to whittle it down. It makes it a lot cheaper when you test fewer indicators, but you also get less information. So they recently put out recommendations for just 3 most important indicators that everybody should measure if they're going to measure soil health. I would argue that a few more are good, but if the funding is limited, at least measuring organic matter respiration and aggregate stability is what they recommended based on their overview of all of the different methods for all of these research plots and looking at what is the most, what showed the most differences. The criteria for indicators like that, we want them to be standardized, have scientific and agronomic relevance, represent diverse processes so that we can really look at, you know, what aspect of soil function isn't working. They need to be sensitive to agricultural management, because if you measure something and then you change your management and that indicator doesn't pick up that you've actually made a difference, it's not a good indicator of soil health. And the interpretations need to be accessible to the public, and that is still probably the most critical aspect that needs more work, is how do we interpret the raw value that comes out. But again, we've made a lot of progress. So, you know, we're no longer at that wooden wheel. We've got something a lot better than that these days, but we're not quite here yet, right? We've still got a ways to get and to go on laboratory soil health assessments. The great thing is NRCS is now at a point where I think the National Soil Health Database is pretty close. It's incorporated into programs. There is a way to pay for soil health testing, soil health management planning based on that testing. So things are moving forward. The indicators that are paid for by NRCS, and actually it's broader than that, these are the basic test package: aggregate stability, soil organic carbon, permanganate oxidizable carbon or active carbon, so basically an organism food source, short-term carbon mineralization or respiration, which is an indicator of organism activity. How much are they breathing? You know, how much CO2 are they putting out? And then acid citrate extractable protein, which is an indicator of organically bound proteins. And proteins are the main part of the organic matter where nitrogen is held in a stable form. So it's the potentially available nitrogen that could be mineralized with the right processes in place. So these indicators are part of the soil health assessment that NRCS pays for, but also that activity has been broadened out. So now there's the ability to pay for just one indicator. There's the ability to pay for additional state recommended indicators. So there's quite a bit of flexibility with that. Then there's interpretation, and that's a little tricky because, you know, in a Georgia Altisol, for example, 2% organic matter is really good, whereas in an Iowa Mollisol, 2% is pretty abysmal and 6% is kind of more what you're looking at. And then there's the quality of the organic matter we also need to look at. But this kind of interpretation, there's a lot more work going on, and NRCS has had some work going on that hoping will continue to move forward to actually provide national level of recommendations through a collaboration with ARS and NRCS. And then there are recommendations. And Marie, I see you have a question, so I'll take that.
Yeah, sorry, I'm confused about who's doing those soil health lab tests. Like, what labs are doing that?
Cornell University is definitely doing them. And there are a whole bunch of labs across the country at this point that are, and I was looking for that list earlier today and couldn't find it. I understand that it has been put out, but I need to find that link. So I'm going to ping a couple of colleagues of mine, and then I'll add that link to the resources here. There are more and more labs.
Yeah, I've sent some in for soil health, and I think maybe Nebraska is where they ended up getting sent. But they were not helpful, to be honest. The results I got back.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it just wasn't, there wasn't a lot of information, and it was definitely those things that you just listed were not all in that soil health assessment. And then I went and it like gave me this great score, like your soils are great. And I was like, okay. Then I went and took what I know to be a very degraded soil and sent it in for the same test. And it told me my soils were great and then I was doing everything right. So I just I have not, I have tried a lot of these and I'm not like, I haven't found one that's any good yet. So if you've got
I
a
know.
recommendation for Midwest soils, you know, these are good prairie soils where I can send something, I
Mhm.
would love to know where
Yeah,
to
I
send
mean,
it.
I know Cornell has analyzed a lot of Midwest soils, and back when I was doing that, we definitely got some very degraded, surprisingly degraded soil results from Iowa farms. So I
Okay,
would say that that picks that up. Also, the Cornell manual is a really good one for going through the concepts of what each indicator means, how they are currently interpreted, which is still, there's a lot of work left to be done on how to interpret them when they're coming from different textures, different regions, different climates. But I would say it's further along in terms of really communicating what is, what is the status and what you do about it.
right.
So you
Because
might try
sometimes I'm
that.
gonna,
I'd love to hear if it
yeah,
works.
I'm gonna tell you my nervousness about NRCS doing these tests and using these to then recommend practices. I'm worried, to be honest with you. I mean, in my opinion, NRCS is a total disaster right now. I mean, the way that this new conservation desktop works and the fact that none of us have any professional judgment anymore is like ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
worry that we're going to send these tests in and no one's going to ever take the time to even go look at a field. We don't even look at, NRCS doesn't even go outside anymore. I mean, they sit in their offices and they put things in a computer and it pushes out some modeled number to tell us if we have resource concerns or not. It's
Yep.
total junk. And the truth is like, we just need to go out and look at a field. Because what I worry about is we're going to send these tests in and it's going to say everything's fine, but it's not.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
I absolutely hear you.
I'm incredibly concerned about that slide that you put up and the fact that NRCS is going to pay for this testing. And then we're going to have to use those results to justify anything we do in the field. I'm just done with NRCS. It's like
It's a
over
very
for me.
valid concern. I have
Yeah,
some of those concerns myself. I will leave my commentary at that for the moment.
yeah, I
Um,
get it. I mean, I know I put 10
yeah,
years in with that agency. So I just,
yeah,
that makes me very nervous,
a
but
lot of
I'll
amazing
try Cornell.
potential.
I'll try
Yeah,
Cornell. I'll send a few samples into Cornell this fall and
yeah,
give that
yeah.
one a
And
try.
let me know how it goes, because that's a collaboration that we can definitely, we can work with them. I still, because of having recently left NRCS, I still have to wait another about 9 months until I can speak with the ARS colleague with whom we were working on the interpretation functions. Because I put that agreement in place so that we would
Sure.
have national recommendations that are based on a raw value measured on a standardized method that then gets interpreted in the context of that soil type and in the context of the management, right? So that should be getting us a lot better of an idea um, than the resource concerns based on web soil survey, which we should say, when that spits out a resource concern, it's not giving you that it's a resource concern, it's giving you a likelihood that that soil type would have that resource concern, which is a valid thing, but I think a lot of people are really confused about it. And I think a lot of people in NRCS, like you have to say, are really confused about what that means. And probably even the people who put it in place don't have necessarily a very good way of explaining what that actually means, even though it's useful when you know how to interpret it. So it's tricky.
Okay.
Hey, Bianca, I
Sorry,
just
I
wanted
just
to,
wanted to put that out there. Since I had your ear, I thought I'd use it.
Yes, appreciate
thanks,
it.
Mary. Yeah, I just want to let you guys know that we have less than a minute.
Yes,
So,
we do.
okay.
So I don't think there's much more to go through here. I mean, basically, the Cornell manual has a table like this in it. And a lot of the soil health management planning work was based on this kind of idea where you assess a constraint, and then there are actually management approaches for addressing that constraint. So that connection is a really key piece of how these assessments become useful. And we've used them. This is Dorn Cox's farm. He had an incredible eutrophication problem in his pond, and his soils were low on phosphorus. So we puzzled, right? Because how do you get eutrophication in a pond that's a phosphorus issue when there's too little phosphorus in the field? Well, it turned out that they had severe compaction, and low activity of the microbes, even though they actually had pretty stable aggregates, they were just really jammed in together, right? So that goes to show you have to assess multiple different things, because the aggregate stability was good, their organic matter content was good, but their respiration was kind of on the low side and their compaction was sky high, so they were grazing horses, and it would rain and take the manure straight down into the field instead of letting it get incorporated into the soil. We put in place a soil health management plan and ended up with a perfectly clear swimmable pond. So you can make those kinds of impacts on a farm, but it takes an understanding of the processes and how to then adjust management to address that. So I would love to hear more, but I know that we're out of time. I think there's a lot of really good questions out there, a lot of discussion to be had. So I think we're headed straight for a break, Beth, right? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's up to the group. Like, we have a 15-minute break. If you want to ask questions for 5 minutes and take a 10-minute break, the thing is at 10:30, we will be starting another session. So we'll leave this room and go to that room. And for those of you who have questions who want to stay, Bianca, are you willing to stay for
I'm
4
totally
minutes,
happy to
5
stay.
minutes?
Yep.
Yeah. So, but don't feel like, for those of you in here, don't feel obligated. Like, I'm not, there's no grade here. Nobody's judging you. So if you want to drop off for
Totally
15
happy to
minutes,
stick
that's
around.
fine. Yeah.
Questions, discussion, aha moments.
So when are you doing a in-person training on this in Michigan?
Good question.
No, that's not a fair question, but that's what's going through my head is really, and we've done some of these with soil pits and all kinds of things at our field days and shown some of these, or taken soil out of fence rows, or done the rain simulator, which I'm sure you're very familiar with.
Yep.
To show soil structure and things, and those are really powerful tools. But that one-on-one, I think, walking around with the grower, that's just my comment, is that's where I'd like to be, at a level where I feel pretty confident doing those things in the field with the grower. I think that's probably the most powerful thing possible.
Yeah, for sure.
And then of course I always get to see, I have compaction, I need more tillage.
Now for that one, there's a comeback for that one, right? You have compaction, it is a symptom of too much tillage. And there is what I like to refer to as tillage addiction. You know, the more coffee you drink, the more coffee you need, right? Does that mean you keep drinking more coffee, or do you manage it at whatever level as Maria picks up her coffee, and I'll do the same. Compaction is a symptom, and we need to address the root cause. If somebody has severe compaction, yeah, they might need some steel to alleviate the initial compaction, or a good cover crop planted at the right time might do it, or a combination of the two. But ideally, we get away from as much tillage as that and start managing the field in a way that avoids putting back more compaction while alleviating compaction that's there. So depending on whether you have surface compaction and you need a lot of fibrous rooting to rebuild those aggregates, or whether you have subsoil compaction and you need some really good tap roots that punch through that subsoil layer to create a channel back through, so that you don't get super wet soils on top, where then if you plow, you're putting back that subsoil compaction, or exacerbating it, because you've got wet soil, and wet soil gets squished and then turns into concrete, basically, right? So you don't want to traffic wet soil, right? So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to all this, and how to understand soils physically and biologically in a way that you can work with a field that has that kind of compaction to turn the spiral around and you know, alleviate the compaction that's there, and then undo and then maintain it at that level.
Yeah, well, I am going to take a break, but I'll throw a hard one at you. Dairy farms, corn silage, lots of traffic, heavy equipment, then manure, then a requirement that it be incorporated. due to runoff and odor concerns. A lot of competing things. I don't expect an answer, but boy, those are some of the things we're up against
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
there. So.
Yeah, where there are opportunities to integrate more grazing, that's always a really tough one, but that can definitely help. Where there
I
are
think-
opportunities to, oh yeah, go ahead, Marie.
Yeah, I was gonna say silage for me, low hanging fruit here in Wisconsin is planting cereal rye after silage, and they're taking it for forage in the spring for heifer feed. It is a
Yes.
slam dunk. Every farmer, I mean, it is like once they realize that, they're like, oh, duh. And you can put manure on it heavy. I try to get guys to put the rye in right away, give it like 2 weeks, and then fine, put 15,000 gallons on. I don't care, the rye will come through it. But it's silage should be a slam dunk for anyone who has cows to feed. It should be, we should always be planting rye after it. And
Yeah.
there's no argument, like there's no financial argument, there's no management argument. It should be really easy.
Absolutely.
So
Awesome.
why do you think we're not doing it? Are people not doing it?
It's like a time thing and just not even thinking about it. And they got to do it once to realize how awesome it is.
Mhm.
And they have
once
to have
realize
success the one
how
time they do it.
forage-
Yeah.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
do
that's
have to
the
have
hope.
time to do it.
Yeah. All right.
But they're spending time cutting alfalfa. They're spending time cutting other crops for feed. And the way we're going with sex semen and you know, these dairies have so many heifers that they're keeping back. It's just, I have yet to have that not be total slam dunk.
Nice.
That's cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I would love to see some of the resources you point people to, Marie, and I'm sure others would too. So any resources you want to share, we'll give them to everybody else too. Because
I mean,
yeah,
honestly,
that's,
we just talked about it. I'm like, you can expect 2 to 3 bales per acre come spring.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, you know, the neighbors are doing it. Talk to this guy, he's doing it. It's not that I'm handing them anything really.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah, New England
It's just-
too, that has been very successful.
it's been successful for sure.
Yeah.
And we're in Wisconsin. We have a lot of cows. I always
Right.
say cover crops are a no-brainer if you've got mouths to feed.
Right.
I've had no problem getting anyone with livestock to grow cover crops. It's
Mm.
straight cash crop folks that it's a tougher sell.
Hmm.
But otherwise it's really not that tough of a sell.
Nice. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
I wanted
Any
to
other
hear more about the pond that you said that was low on phosphorus, and when they added that, it cleared the pond up. Can you kind of expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, it sounds like I went through that a little too fast. So when you get phosphorus in fresh water, you tend to get eutrophication. So you don't want too much phosphorus in fresh water because it's usually the limiting nutrient for algae growth. So if you put too much in, algae are no longer limited, and now those algae just bloom across the whole pond. So now you've got a bunch of algae that then start to decompose and take away the oxygen during that decomposition, because the bacteria that decompose the algae take up the oxygen more easily than everything else in the water, and so you can end up with fish kills and that kind of thing. So phosphorus in a pond, a big problem. Phosphorus in the field, you need enough to feed your plants. You don't want too much phosphorus in the field because it can get into fresh water. And that's one of our major water quality issues, is too much phosphorus in agriculture ends up getting into our fresh waters and polluting them and causing algae blooms and fish kills and that kind of thing. So what happened in that field is they had their farm pond that they used for irrigation, but also for recreation. And the soils were showing low phosphorus. So we were so puzzled because the soils had too little phosphorus. And so we were thinking, wait, how is this happening? How are we having a symptom of too much phosphorus in the pond when the soils actually don't even have enough phosphorus to grow a good crop? What we discovered was that because the soil was so compacted, the manure phosphorus from the horses they were grazing wasn't getting into the soil. It wasn't getting incorporated in the soil because there wasn't enough biological activity to decompose the manure. There wasn't enough worm activity to sort of biologically till the manure into the soil amongst the grasses. There wasn't enough grass growth to get good infiltration of the water when it did fall. And so when it rained, straight up manure that has plenty of phosphorus would run off that hill slope all the way into the farm pond at the bottom. So we were not getting the benefit of the manure in the soil because it wasn't getting in, because there wasn't enough biological activity and it was really severely compacted. Instead, we were getting an environmental issue with that manure getting straight into the pond, where it was causing harm instead of getting us the economic value of that manure actually feeding the plant. So we achieved a win-win. Dorn went through with a piece of zone tillage equipment. He basically cut slots in the contour lines. So the hill going down like this, he went along the contours, cutting slots to get through the compacted layer, so that when it rained, the water would go down into that slot as it ran down the hill, first off. Then he seeded deep-rooted cover crops into the poorly growing perennial pasture. Those cover crop roots, when those cover crops germinated, those roots, because we designed them to be deep tap-rooted kind of cover crops, those roots went down into those slots, filling those slots, keeping them open. And those plants grew big enough that now they could really take up a lot of water and a lot of nutrients, and they had the kind of rooting where as the water ran down just a little bit into the slot, that water with plenty of manure nutrients would then feed that growing cover crop. He also interseeded legumes so that that phosphorus of that manure could be easily taken up and cause more nitrogen fixation, so that overall we were stimulating the whole system. We were getting diverse cover crops started in the middle of a poorly functioning pasture that then, I believe, got harvested, and the pasture started to come back as we started to actually get the phosphorus in the ground. I think there was also a pH issue in this field. I don't remember so well right now. So I think he also added some wood ash. So that added some potassium, which tends to be low in those soils, and increased the pH a little bit. That allowed the legumes to do better, because legumes do really poorly in low pH. So the whole system, right? We looked at the whole picture of chemical, physical, and biological constraints that were happening in that field, and specifically designed biological, physical, and chemical interventions to address those concerns.
That's fascinating. Okay, I'm cutting us off. We have
All right.
like we have to go to the other thing now, but that was incredible. Yeah, Carrie, I hope that answered your question. And for all of you, if you have questions, feel free to email me. We'll put contact information in there, but Bianca and her team are available. So.
Okay, yeah,
questions.
I'm gonna need to have further conversation with you, Bianca. I've got a prawn fisherman who his whole prawns were not growing, and there was a abundant amount of algae growth and algae bloom in his pond. And so we were trying to figure out what happened to the prawn. So his whole harvest, was ruined because there was not enough oxygen in the water.
Yeah.
And so we were trying to figure out what would be the next steps to, test to see what happened. Was that actually what happened? Because the pond uses a natural stream that runs through the property and it slopes down. And he has 2 tobacco farmers that is above him. So we were wondering if the fertilizer, the nitrogen, or the phosphorus got into the pond, created the algae bloom, and it took the oxygen from the pond.
Definitely a possibility, and that would be a tougher one to fix.
Yeah.